So great to be with you this morning. This is totally my idea of a good time on a Saturday morning to get together and talk about the Bible and talk about how reliable it is. When I went to Egypt, I wasn't sure what I was going to see. Lots of people ask me, so what are you hoping to see in Egypt? And my typical answer was, I don't know what I don't know. I haven't studied Egypt formally. I've been studying the Bible for decades formally. And so I'm curious what I'm going to see that's going to illuminate the biblical text. And I had so much fun because around every corner there was another surprise. And I'm continuing to have surprises as I read more widely about Egypt and learn. So I even was adding more pictures into the PowerPoint this morning. Lying in bed last night, wait, there's another part of the tabernacle that I saw in Egyptian temples. So this is fun. This is going to be a good time. Before I get into Exodus, on my table, I just wanted to mention that I have brochures for the apologetics program at Talbot School of Theology, where I teach. So Biola University has 6 or 7 schools that are part of it. Talbot is the School of Theology. I teach mostly undergraduates. I don't teach in our apologetics program, but Sean McDowell, J.P. Moreland, and others do, and William Lane Craig as well as a visiting scholar. So if you're interested in studying apologetics from anywhere, pick up some brochures and you can check out more about Talbot. I think most of you have probably heard of Talbot's program. It's well regarded. The other announcement I wanted to make is that I have a YouTube channel. So every Tuesday, I release a video called Torah Tuesday, and it's about 10 minutes long, and it's a slow trek through the book of Exodus. When I took this screenshot, I was in chapter 6. I'm actually just finished chapter 21. I've been working on it for 5 years minus the year that I had a hiatus, so 4 years worth of weekly videos. There's a lot of material there, just taking a slow trek through Exodus and sharing what I'm seeing in the Hebrew, sharing things that I've noticed about ancient culture and history. So this is a free way for you to study with me as I learn about the book of Exodus. Why Exodus? I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the command not to take the Lord's name in vain. It was published by Penn State University Press. Then I turned it into a book that anyone can read. And when I say anyone, I mean anyone in this room could read it. My kids tested it out. My daughter was 17 when I wrote it, and we took out all the words she didn't know. And there have been homeschool groups and Christian high school groups that have read it all the way on up to Doctor of Ministry, undergraduate, graduate, Doctor of Ministry, there's a men's Bible study that started Thursday night this week in Houston that's going through the book. So it's a book that works for small group study. And I got a letter one time from a woman whose mother was 94 and had just finished reading the book. And she said, where was bearing God's name 30 years ago when I was trying to teach children's Sunday school and I could not figure out what to do with the Old Testament stories? This book has helped me so much. I wish I had it years ago. So doing my dissertation on the 10 Commandments kind of opened up the world of Exodus for me. And then I was invited to write the commentary on Exodus for the Baker Commentary on the Old Testament series. So this is not available yet. If you try to look this up on Amazon, you won't find it because I'm still writing it. But they made me a cover just so I can keep my eyes on the prize. So I'm 72% done with this commentary, and I'm working my way very carefully through the book. And I love Exodus. I'm convinced that it is one of the most important foundational books of the Old Testament. And that's why I scheduled a trip to Egypt. Because of how much of the book takes place in Egypt, I felt like I can't write this 750-page commentary that takes place halfway in Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula if I've never been there to see it with my own eyes. I'll probably be saying things that will sound dumb to somebody who's been there. So I planned a trip to go, again, not knowing what I didn't know. And it has awakened in me a love for Egypt, so that on the plane to get here, I was reading this book about the Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context. And I finished the whole thing in a weekend. It's got all kinds of great full-color illustrations. And David Falk is the author. He's showing how the Ark of the Covenant in Israel's tabernacle is patterned after the way Egyptians make objects. It uses the same technology and some of the same assumptions. And so why does this matter? To anticipate where we're going, this matters because it helps to establish the fact that Exodus is an old book that actually fits in the ancient context that it says it's describing. There are lots of scholars out there who would say Exodus is a late invention, that somebody came up, maybe somebody in the days of Josiah or Hezekiah, came up with an origin story for Israel in order to make them feel like they were somebody or something. And so they invented this Exodus from Egypt story and kind of tried to tell it as if it was old. Well, my study has convinced me over and over that there's no way somebody living in the days of Josiah could have written the book of Exodus, because some of the language that's used wasn't used anymore in the days of Josiah. Some of the Egyptian loan words were no longer in use. Some of the technologies had changed. Some of the measurement systems had changed. There's lots of things that had changed by the time of the monarchy. So this tells me that the stories we read in Exodus actually fit really well in their ancient context, the context that they purport to describe. So what we're going to focus on today is some pictorial evidence. Now, John, I apologize for getting in your pictures. I was thinking of all the lectures I needed to illustrate for years to come. The fact is, John is a much better photographer than I am. So I'm going to show you my pictures, and then later maybe he'll share all his pictures with me and I can upgrade my PowerPoint. Because I found out after I got home that there was a fuzzy thing under the lens of my camera. Like inside, I had to like open up the shutter to get it out. So I have a blurry spot in the top corner of every picture that I took on the whole trip, which means I need to go back. So that will be so sad. This is an image that came across my feed this week. A friend of mine asked ChatGPT, an artificial intelligence, to create a painting that included the entire storyline of the Bible. So he just posted this and said, I have so many questions. And so do I. Like, why doesn't Jesus have a face? And what sort of animal is that? Is that has 6 legs and 2 heads? Or is that 2 animals? Steamship? Really? Truck? Okay. So you look at this, and in just a moment, you can tell, okay, this isn't legit. Whoever is making this picture is making it far after the events it describes, because it's adding into the picture things that are very anachronistic. There were no trucks, there were no steamships in the days of the Bible. Never mind all the other problems, right? So this is the kind of thing I'm always alert for when I'm reading scripture. Is there something poking its head in the picture or showing up, ruining the shot, that is out of place, that doesn't seem to belong here? And from time to time, people will suggest, there weren't camels, or there weren't chariots, or so Exodus is out of date because it's not lining up with what we know. And again, these theories get debunked by people who do careful historical work. So let me say from the outset, I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm a biblical scholar. So I don't even fully understand all the things I'm going to show you. But after immersing myself in the biblical text, in Exodus in particular, for about 15 years, I saw things in Egypt that made me go, oh, wow, here's a good connection. So let's start with the best one. The picture that John showed of me standing in the tomb in the way of his good shot was actually my favorite spot we visited in Egypt. It's the tomb of Rekhmere, who was a vizier of one of the pharaohs. That's the same role that Joseph had under the pharaoh that he worked for. It's somebody who oversees all the different industries in Egypt. And this particular vizier wanted to commemorate the work that he had overseen during his tenure. And so in his tomb, every line, every row of illustration is showing us a different industry that he oversaw. So there's leather work, and there's metal work, and there's like building monuments and inscribing them. And it shows you sort of like a comic book, step by step, how they did things. This was my favorite spot because in this bottom row here, what we're looking at is the making of mud bricks. And if you've read Exodus, you know why that excites me, because the Israelites were subject to forced labor under Pharaoh, and they had to make mud bricks. In chapter 5, we're told that Pharaoh says, I'm not going to supply straw for you anymore. You have to make bricks without straw. Well, here is a depiction of Semitic slaves, laborers, who are making bricks. And I had my TA draw it out for us so we can see more carefully what's going on. So on the left, what you see is the pond where they're drawing water. They pour that on the mud on the bottom there, and then they stomp around in the mud until it's mixed in. So they would add straw, bits of straw, and then stomp around. Why straw? Because as the straw decomposes, it releases a chemical that makes the brick hard and keeps it from crumbling after it's dried. So they would, mix it all around with their feet and then take buckets of it and bring it to the guy who's putting it in brick molds and dumping them out in the sun. And they would dry in the sun, and then after they're all dry, somebody would stack them up. And the one guy there is measuring the stack to see how many bricks they've got. He's using a measuring tool. Maybe you recall, also in Exodus chapter 5, when Pharaoh decides not to give them straw, he says, I'll just pick it up in verse 19. Is that a 19? It's a 13. I'm 47 now, and those numbers are really tiny. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, complete the work required of you for each day. That is your daily quota, just as when you had straw. And Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelite overseers they had appointed, saying, why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before? So the fact that they're measuring this stack tells me, it looks to me like they're seeing if they've met their quota. And then some other guys are grabbing the bricks and carrying them, and my photo doesn't show the whole scene, but they bring the bricks over to a temple that's being built, and they stack them to make a ramp, and that's how they drag these enormous stones up to put them at the top of a wall. If you've ever wondered, how in the world do they put up these massive pillars like the ones John showed us at Karnak? Like, how do they get it up there? Well, they would build it up with mud bricks and then drag the stone up on top and set it. Now, the particular building project that the Israelites were working on, we find out in Exodus chapter 1, was they were building store cities of Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. Now, the word for store cities, miskanot, is fascinating, and this was another really fun surprise on the trip. So John and Lacey and I did a little extra excursion, and one morning we got up at 4 a.m. and we got shuttled to this field, and we climbed into a hot air balloon, and we flew over the Luxor Valley, where all these ancient monuments are. Now, this was the first thing we did when we got to Luxor, so I had no idea what we were looking at. But we were just up in the balloon with our cameras trying to get shots of everything and hoping that we would understand what we were looking at later. This is one of the things that I was curious about. I noticed that there were all these sort of bubble-looking structures in rows along the side, and I wondered what that was. And then the next day, or later that day, maybe it was, we got down and saw them in person. So these are the mud brick storage facilities at the Ramesseum, which is the funerary temple of Ramses II. So this is about 400 miles away from Cairo, from Goshen, where the Israelites lived. So the Israelites didn't build these. They lived in another area. But Ramses was a prolific builder. He built monuments and temples everywhere he could. He built, I think, more than anybody else. And so if the Israelites were building storage cities for Pharaoh, they very likely looked just like this up in Goshen. And these are massive. It's hard to get a sense of scope. I should have had a person standing in this picture so that you could see. It's about the size of a semi-truck trailer, like in terms of like how wide and tall it is. And it's like a long row of it. So you could just put a ton of stuff, and there are 80 of these, 80 storage tubes on the site of the funerary temple of Ramses II. Why do they need storage facilities? What are they storing? Well, this is Ramses' funerary temple, which means this is the place he wants people to continue to worship him after he's dead. So they believed in an afterlife. They had strong feelings about the afterlife, and it was very important that they kept being fed in the afterlife. So they would set this temple up so that people could venerate them and bring food offerings, and that's partly how they're going to stay alive. And you can't count on the next pharaoh or the next regime to properly worship you when you're dead. So before you die, in fact, the first year of your reign, you start building the funerary temple and building storage warehouses and stocking them full of all the things, grain and wine and oil and incense and anything you're going to need. You cram in there, and it's all for you. It's all for your glory. Isn't it fascinating that the Israelites in the book of Exodus go from serving Pharaoh by providing what's needed for his worship, they go from that to serving Yahweh and bringing him offerings instead. The book of Exodus sometimes people think of as the book of liberation or freedom. Like this is the book that sets the oppressed free. And that's not quite right, because God doesn't just set the Hebrews free and say, have a good life. He sets them free in order to worship and serve him. He becomes their new master. And we find out over and over again what a better master he is than the one they had in Egypt. Let me give you one example. I just talked about the quotas for bricks that they had to make. The phrase that describes these quotas in Exodus 5 is davar yom b'yomo. The stuff day for each day is how it's said in Hebrew. So every day, the Israelites have to meet a particular quota, providing for Pharaoh what he needs to live in the afterlife. When the Israelites get in the wilderness, in the Sinai Peninsula, in chapter 16, they're hungry and they're complaining, and God provides manna. Specifically, in verse 4, it says, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather davar yom b'yomo. Their daily task is to gather enough food for themselves that God provided for them. So Pharaoh said, no more straw for you. You have to scatter and gather it yourself. And it's all for him. And there's no benefit for the people doing the work. What a different master Yahweh is. He sends them out and he says, look what I've provided. Go and collect what you need each day. And over again, we see this contrast. So why use the same phrase for manna that you would use for mud bricks? Wouldn't that be triggering? Well, God wants to show the contrast. And that sets the stage for us to appreciate these other similarities between what God's doing and what they're doing in Egypt. By holding them up side by side, we see not just the similarities, but the stark contrast between what Yahweh is like and what Pharaoh is like. Here's a basket from the Egyptian Museum that's right about the right size for a baby. So I took a picture of it. They made baskets out of reeds and papyrus plants, and it would blend right in, on the shores of the river. One thing that I think is kind of fun is that the Hebrew word for basket used in Exodus chapter 2 is tebah, which is a word that usually means chest, but here it's being used to refer to a basket. And it's the only other place it appears in the Old Testament is in Genesis to describe the ark that Noah builds. So Noah builds this big boat, and Moses' mother's like, I'm going to do what Noah did to save my son from destruction. So she built an ark for Noah. Now this is for Moses. This is a different word for ark than we get later in Exodus when they're building the tabernacle and build the Ark of the Covenant. That's a different word. But both words have Egyptian counterparts. And this is an example of the borrowing of Egyptian vocabulary. In Egyptian, the word, let me make sure I get it right. The word is tebet or debet, and it was tebah in Hebrew. So a related word. And in Egyptian, that word can mean either chest or basket. And so it's just fascinating to me, the borrowing of language and the borrowing of concepts that we come across. This is a blurry photo, but it's some flint tools. And in chapter 4, when Moses is heading back to Egypt with his family, there's this really weird incident that happens with Zipporah, and she's with Yahweh, and Zipporah to the rescue circumcises their son, and so that God doesn't kill Moses, which is a good thing. But these are the kind of tools that the Egyptians had as well. In the Q&A time, if you want to ask me more about the Zipporah story, I'm happy to help explain what's going on there. But we have more pictures to look at. This is one of my favorites. So I knew before I went to Egypt that Pharaoh is often depicted standing in this pose. It's called the mace pose. And the oldest example we have of it is on the right. This is the Narmer palette. It's actually like a makeup palette. If you flip it over, it has a kind of round indentation where you could mix the black paint that they put around their eyes. So this is a huge object, and we got to see the actual thing in the Cairo Museum, which was so cool. So this is my picture of the real thing. And what it shows us is that Pharaoh is the strong-armed one. So he's holding a mace in one hand, and of course his feet are sideways. This is so strange how Egyptians stand. They're always frontal, but their legs and, whatever. It's hard to stand like that. So it's a mace, and then he's holding his enemies by the scruff of their hair, and he's getting ready to clobber them. And I knew that this picture existed, and that it showed Pharaoh's strong arm. What I had no idea about is how ubiquitous it is everywhere in Egypt. Every temple you walk into has got Pharaoh, whichever Pharaoh it was, standing in this pose. And you can see they go from being more like this to lunging in later examples. The one on the left is from the temple of Ramses III. And it actually says in hieroglyphs right under his knife that Pharaoh is the strong-armed one. So it's not just showing him like this, but it's describing him as the one with the strong arm. And in one of the temples we went into, I think it was Ramses III, there were huge pillars as you walked in, and on every pillar, it had Ramses standing there, getting ready to clobber a different nationality in his other hand. So all of his enemies, I conquered these people, and these people, and these people, and these people. Okay, why does this matter? Because in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, God describes his defeat of Pharaoh in exactly these terms. Exodus chapter 6, verse 6. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and mighty acts of judgment. This is the first place we see it, but it actually appears multiple times throughout the Bible. And if you do a search for God's outstretched arm or his strong arm, here's what you find. It's used repeatedly, but only in situations where they're reflecting back on the Exodus. God does not talk about defeating the Canaanites with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. It's only the Egyptians that get defeated with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Why? Because God is co-opting Pharaoh's favorite way of talking about himself, and he's saying, you think you're something special? I'm stronger. My arm is stronger than your arm. So this happens in multiple places in the book of Exodus, where the phrases that were common in Egypt get co-opted to tell the story. If this book was invented in the days of Josiah, I don't think we would see this kind of exact reuse and a kind of co-opting of Egyptian themes. All right, here's another one that I think is super fun. This has a special relevance for apologetics, because I don't know about you, but when I talk to people about the Bible or about the Christian faith, and if they have objections that arise out of the book of Exodus, usually one of the top objections to the Christian faith is, okay, you're telling me that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and then he judged him for having a hard heart. That doesn't seem fair. How could a good God cause someone to be sinful and then judge them for their sin? This just doesn't add up to me. So as you're in conversations with people about Pharaoh's hard heart, this, I think, is a really helpful tool. So as I was working on my Exodus commentary, getting to the chapters where this comes up repeatedly, and it's in the plagues, the signs and wonders chapters, what I noticed is that there's actually 3 different Hebrew words that all refer to what happens to Pharaoh's heart. So 3 different words, they don't all mean the same thing, but usually they're translated the same way into English. They're all just lumped together into hardening of the heart. One of those words, so the first 2 are more or less synonymous. They mean his heart is made firm. Now in English, to have a hard heart is to be cruel or to be unyielding. Like hard-heartedness is like lack of empathy. You know, that's one of the ways we think about it. That's not really what it means in Hebrew or in Egyptian. To have a firm heart in Hebrew or Egyptian is to have a heart that's unresponsive, or to have a heart that's determined to get the job done. This is what I tell students at Biola University is, if you want to graduate, you need to have a firm heart. You can't just kind of try to graduate. You can't just show up to class sometimes and do some of the work. You actually have to be determined that you are going to get the job done, and you have to show up to class, and you have to complete the assignments and study for your tests and get that internship, and all of that requires a firm heart. Normally, in the book of Exodus, when Pharaoh's described as having a firm heart, it's what God does to Pharaoh. God gives him a firm heart so that he can finish what he started. Nobody's making Pharaoh do what he hasn't freely chosen to do. Pharaoh freely chooses this path, and God eggs him on. He says, all right, finish what you started. The third Hebrew word is different. The third Hebrew word talks about making Pharaoh's heart heavy. And this is where things get lost in translation, and probably why it doesn't show up in our English Bibles, because for us, to have a heavy heart means what? To be sad. And this is not about Pharaoh being sad. I think that to have a heavy heart is an echo of an Egyptian concept that was super important to them. I already told you they're obsessed with the afterlife. They're making preparations for it all their life. And one of the things they imagine will happen in the afterlife is that they'll go through a period of testing to see whether they qualify to live in the underworld. And there's a document that you may have heard of called the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which actually isn't a book. It's a series of spells that are customizable depending on who you are and what you want to include and how wealthy you are probably. And so if you're wealthy, you would commission someone, a scribe, to create a customized Book of the Dead for you that would include scenes like this one with all of the stuff you need to be able to say. And the scenes are painted in such a way that you're going to come out positive, right? That as you go through this challenge, you will beat the challenge. So this is like your Cliff's Notes that you're taking with you, or your cheat sheet that you're taking with you into the afterlife. So that when you get to this challenge, you know what to say and you know how you want it to turn out. And so people would actually be buried with these documents so that they had them in the afterlife. And one of the most popular scenes or spells to include in the Book of the Dead is the weighing of the heart. So here's a drawing of it so we can see it a little more clearly. This is this particular version of it is the version of Hunefer. This is the guy in the white clothes on the left is Hunefer. He's the dead guy. He's preparing to be dead when he has this commissioned, but then he's actually dead when it gets buried with him. He's being led by the Egyptian god Anubis, who's holding the symbol of life. He's being led to this next challenge. And the challenge is a huge scale on which 2 things are weighed. On the left, we have a little jar that contains the heart of Hunefer. On the other side of the scale is a feather that represents the Egyptian concept of ma'at. Ma'at is a difficult word to translate, but it's basically the idea of righteousness. It includes order and harmony, and you're in right relationship with your neighbors. You haven't defrauded anyone. You haven't caused a ruckus wherever you went. If you maintain ma'at, you're a good citizen, a righteous citizen. And so the goal is for your heart to be level with ma'at. If it's heavier than ma'at, you are guilty of injustice. And you will be gobbled, your heart will be gobbled up by that composite dude who's there. He's like a part hippo, part lion, part alligator. His name is Amit, and he just gobbles up your heart, and then whoop, there we go, no afterlife for you, because you need your heart, of course. And the guy at the end is the god Thoth, who is the scribal god. He's writing down whether you pass the test or not. He's keeping notes, keeping score. So this is, I think, super interesting, because if this really is the background for the concept of Pharaoh's heavy heart, here's what we need to know. Whenever Pharaoh's heart is made heavy, almost all the time, it's Pharaoh who's making his own heart heavy, which is a kind of tongue-in-cheek way of saying Pharaoh is failing to be a good ruler even by his own standards. Never mind God's. He's ruling, he's supposed to be ruling according to the Egyptian principles of Ma'at, and by opposing Yahweh, he's wreaking havoc on the whole land. All the plagues that come are coming to disrupt Ma'at. How can you say that Pharaoh is maintaining order in his realm when there's frogs everywhere, and then the locusts come and eat all the crops, and then the hail's destroying everything? These things are disruption to the natural order, and so Pharaoh is being shown to be a terrible ruler. So God uses the idiom or figure of speech that would make sense in an Egyptian context, and we saw lots of examples of these. These are pictures from the museum in Cairo, different versions where you can see the heart being weighed. This one's got vultures. I'm just going to point out the vultures at the top that are standing guard, and we'll come back to vultures later. This one's interesting because this was in the little temple in the workman's village in Deir al-Medina, and you can see that there's a deity figure there who's actually holding on to the ropes, and kind of like he's there to balance it for you so that it comes out right. So notice this isn't a record of what happened. This is what they hope will happen. Like, hey, if I'm a little short on the balance, could you just kind of even that out for me? We think of God giving us his mercy and grace on Judgment Day, and the Egyptians had the same idea. They needed mercy and grace on Judgment Day. Okay, so that's Pharaoh's hard heart. That brings us to the confrontations with Pharaoh. And what's the first showdown that Moses and Aaron have with Pharaoh? They take Moses' staff and cast it down, and it becomes a snake. It actually doesn't become just a snake. When God meets with Moses at Mount Sinai, that's the plan. He's going to throw it down, and it's going to become a snake. But then it actually happens, and it becomes not a nahash, but a tanin, which is a sea serpent, which is a more mythologically significant label, and it probably is hinting of what's to come, because what happens with the tanin, so Aaron's staff becomes a tanin, and then Pharaoh's like, oh, we can do that too. So he turns a staff into a snake. Now that's a whole ball of wax there. Like how does that happen? It seems to me that Pharaoh's magicians actually do have some limited powers. But once you get four into the signs and wonders, they've run out of power. And they're like, we can't match this anymore. So what we're seeing is the outstripping of Egyptian power. But what happens to the snakes? Moses and Aaron's snake swallows the snake or sea serpent of Pharaoh, just like Pharaoh's army will be swallowed in the sea in chapter 14. It's the same word, and I think this is maybe one reason why it's a sea serpent, so that we can see this is a warning of what's to come. This actually doesn't hurt you right now. But if you continue to oppose me, I am the one who can swallow you whole, and I won't spit you out. So one thing that's interesting to note is, this is not my photograph, by the way, because we were not allowed to take photographs in this room. But this is the coffin of King Tut, and he's standing there with a flail and a staff, like a shepherd's staff, and on his forehead he has a snake and a vulture head. These represent Upper and Lower Egypt, and they're a symbol of, these are all symbols of his royal authority. So again, God doesn't show up at Pharaoh's temple in a Tesla with a smartphone trying to do something. Like, he's not showing up anachronistically. When he shows up, when he sends Moses and Aaron, they're talking in ways that make sense to Pharaoh. They're using his language to show, Yahweh's saying, I'm boss. You think you have royal authority. My royal authority is greater than yours. So there's a constant undermining of Pharaoh's authority. Okay, about vultures. There's a beloved passage. This is one of my favorite passages in the Bible, Exodus chapter 19. And God, this is the first words that God says at Mount Sinai through Moses to the people. Then Moses went up to God, and Yahweh called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Except that it doesn't really say eagles in Hebrew. It says vultures. Now, I don't blame the translators in this case. Vultures doesn't have quite the right metaphoric connotations to us that eagles do. Eagles seem like majestic and whatever, maternal. This is a nice maternal image. But griffin vultures are a big deal in the Sinai Peninsula. This is a model of one that I saw in one spot. I didn't see one in real life, which was sad. I saw this one on a trip to Israel, not Egypt. But they live in Israel and down in the Sinai Peninsula and into Egypt. The wingspan of a griffin vulture can be over 9 feet. They're massive, and they're quite at home in the wilderness. They make their nest in the rocky cliffs. That's where they raise their young. They're just very at home there. And it's a symbol, think of Lower Egypt. I get Lower and Upper Egypt mixed up. I think it's the symbol of, I think it's Upper Egypt. I don't remember. Anyway, you'll see it all over the place in Egyptian art. So here's an example. This is a scene from the funerary temple of Ramses III. And there's lots of things we could notice here. Notice the kind of boat thing in the middle. There's a boat. It's called a barque, B-A-R-Q-U-E. And this is a symbolic ritual object that would get paraded through the streets on special holidays. And so you can see that it's sitting on long poles, and priests would actually carry it through town on their shoulders. And on the bark, there's a box. You see the box right there in the middle? That box is a shrine to whatever deity this is, with a canopy over the shrine. Remember that for later. And what's poised right above the whole scene? A vulture, with its outstretched wings protecting this sacred object that represents the deity and will be then paraded through the streets. So when they had festivals, the gods would come out of the temples, the priests would carry them down to the water or carry them to another sacred site, and the people would parade behind and they'd give offerings and stuff. Yes, so many interesting things here. The parading around of a deity in a canopied shrine is something to take note of. Not only that, Ramses II is famous for a particular battle that he fought. This is a battle against the Hittites called the Battle of Kadesh. And his battle compound has the same dimensions as the tabernacle, or the same, I don't know if it's the same dimensions, the same proportions as the tabernacle. And the Battle of Kadesh is the most celebrated battle in human history. I think there are 5 temples in Egypt that we know of, that we found, that have the scenes and description of this battle carved into the wall. So So think about Ramses II. I've already told you he was a prolific builder. He was so proud of this battle. Now, a little side note, historians tell us that this probably was not a very decisive victory. More like they both gave each other black eyes and then went home. But the way Pharaoh tells the story, he caught the biggest fish, right? He single-handedly routed the Hittites and drowned them all in the Orontes River. And all of this is taking place in these descriptions that are carved on the walls of particular temples. So this is a shot. I didn't take this picture because it's at the temple of Abu Simbel, which John and Lacey went to on a side trip, but I didn't get to go to it. This is John Walton's picture of it, probably taken by his wife Kim, because she usually takes his pictures. And what you can see is an outer tent and an inner tent inside of it. Here's another, I discovered this week that you can tour the temple of Abu Simbel yourselves from the comforts of your own home. There's like a 3D thing you can pan around and look at all the walls and look at the ceilings and walk through the corridors. Actually, John had a picture of that temple that he showed us where he was saying there's 2 walkways and it's hard to not get shadows and people in them. You can now just go and kind of troll your way through it and see stuff. So that's what I did on Wednesday morning, and I found the wall where it is. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is my screenshot of this scene. You can see the chariots and horses on the bottom, and then there's like a row of shields making the outer perimeter of Ramses' war tent. Like this is his headquarters on the move, and then the tent inside it with the throne inside a special shrine. And here's a drawing of it that somebody made, so you can see more of the details of it. Notice there are winged falcons right at the Holy of Holies, or where the throne is, winged falcons around the cartouche with the name of the king. Notice that it's on an east-west axis with the entrance over here leading straight to the throne room. And here's another line drawing of it that I came across. Our tabernacle that God tells Moses to build is on an east-west axis with the same outer perimeter and an inner tent with a throne where the presence of God is flanked by winged cherubim. Like, whoa. And both of them are transportable. And the accounts of the Battle of Kadesh on the temple walls come in 2 forms. There's what they call the bulletin or the record, which is a narrative of the account of the battle. And then there's a poetic account of the battle side by side. And so in each of the temples, you have different amounts of information, but all of them have a bulletin and a poetic version of the battle, kind of like the book of Exodus, where in chapter 14 you have the narrative of the defeat at the Sea of Reeds, and in chapter 15 you have the song about it that's poetic. And then they built a tent that's the same dimensions as the tent of Ramses II. Why would God do this? To show he's boss. You have a new king now. Forget the old one. I've replaced him. So then they build the tabernacle. And this was my biggest surprise in Egypt, was how many elements that we saw that related to the tabernacle. Because when we went to Egypt last year, I was at about chapter 16, 17 in the book, which is just after they've left Egypt. And I thought, okay, good. I'm done with Egypt, so I'm going to go see the stuff, and then I can revise my chapters. What I had just had no grid for how much I was going to learn that would help with the rest of the book after they leave Egypt and they are building the tabernacle. So one of the things that was really striking about all the temples we saw is the pillars were very often either giant papyrus plants or giant lotus plants. So I don't know if you remember the old movie Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, where this professor dad is working on a shrinking machine and then his kids accidentally get shrunk and they're like this big and they end up getting taken out with the trash and they have to make their way through the backyard back to the house to find their parents. And the blades of grass are giant and they're like trying, the ants are going to eat them. And it's a funny movie. This is exactly how I felt in these temples. You have these giant pillars next to you. So the ones on the right are again the Karnak temple. Let me give you a sense of the scope of size. You already saw Lacey standing next to one. You could see they're big. They are almost 10 feet in diameter. And guess how many of us could fit on the top of the pillar of the ones that are open? So that in the hypostyle hall in the Karnak temple, there's 134 of these pillars. And some of them are closed papyrus and others are open papyrus. The ones in the middle are taller and they're open, so they're wider. 100 men can comfortably fit on the top of one pillar. That's how big it is. It's 18 feet across. And the pillars are, the side pillars are 43 feet tall, but the center ones are 70 feet tall. I mean, it's so hard to even get a sense of the scope of it, the size of it, without being there. But all of them, and here's the temple at Luxor. You can see all the pillars in my blurry picture are like bundles of plants with closed tops. I think this one is lotus flowers that are bundled together and the top of the lotus is closed. Here's another one of the massive pillars. It's just kind of off by itself in the Karnak temple, so you can get a sense for how you might fit 100 people up on the top of that thing. And then there's a closed one on the right that you can see a little better how it looks like a bundle of reeds or bundle of flowers. Here's another thing, the rooftops, the ceilings, I should say, of the temples, when they are still there, are blue with stars. So this is looking up at the temple ceilings, and they painted them to look like the night sky. So you're walking through plants, and you're looking up at the night sky, and I'm thinking about how God said to make the lampstand in the tabernacle with blossoms and branches on it, and how the curtains for the tabernacle are woven out of purpley blue thread with gold clasps to hold them together, and it would have sparkled like the night sky over their heads for the few people who were allowed to go into the tabernacle. How about the furniture that we have in the tabernacle? Almost everywhere in all these temples, we would see, this is called a palanquin. This is Pharaoh being carried on a throne in a box with a canopy over it, carried on poles by his servants on the left. That one's from the funerary temple of Ramses III. Notice that there is a winged deity at his back, a winged protector. Notice too that the top of the canopy above his head, it's called a frieze, is a whole row of cobras. So we've got snakes. These are called uraeuses when they occur in something like this. And then on the right, we have the statue of Anubis, the god of the underworld, being carried on a golden box on poles. So King Tut had this in his tomb. This was recovered from his tomb. And it probably was used to carry his organs in jars to his tomb, and then they were taken out and put in the special box that they belonged in. So it was just a temporary ritual object that was transporting Pharaoh from one place to the other, or parts of his innards. It kind of looks familiar, doesn't it? Here's another bark with carrying poles, and you can see it has a shrine with a canopy over it and winged. At the top, this time we don't have a vulture, but we have vulture's wings on a solar disk representing the sun god. And notice the whole thing is sitting on a box that sort of resembles the Ark of the Covenant. We don't get any boats in the tabernacle. Boats were really important in Egyptian imagery, probably because that's how they got around. The Nile River was the main way to get around Egypt. They hadn't invented the wheel yet, until there were wheels by the time of the Israelites, but wheels were a pretty recent invention. And so boats were the way they got around and the way they moved massive stones and massive timbers and all of that. So boats were really important. I think when Israel left Egypt and they left the Nile behind them, there was no need for boats. You're not going to get around Israel in boats. Here is a tent of one of the Egyptian princesses. It's made of leather that's stitched together. It's like a party tent, so she can go and have shade when she's out doing something. So all of these factors together, the technology for making tents and boxes and for carrying things, reminds me of Israel's Ark of the Covenant, with its winged protectors, carried on poles by priests, housed in a canopy tent with another tent around it. So many similarities. By the way, I learned reading this book on the Ark of the Covenant that the average Egyptian, and that would include the Israelites when they were there too, did not have a couch or a chair or a bed or even a box. You were considered quite wealthy if you had a box. So these were the status symbols of ancient Egypt. If we get a raise or win the lottery, most of us, the first thing we think about is upgrading our vehicle. If an Egyptian really made it big, they would order a box and a bed and a chair. Like, furniture was the status symbol of the ancient world. So the Israelites leaving Egypt are not carrying any furniture with them. The only furniture in their community would be these sacred objects, which were super expensive to make, but the technology existed in Egypt to make them at this time in history. Here's some more winged protectors. You see them everywhere. These were from the Cairo Museum on the left and the Ramesseum on the right. Here's some more. I mean, almost every wall had winged protectors. Here's King Tut's throne, which has winged, like seraphim kind of figures on each arm. This is the Egyptian god, I think his name is Wedjet, the cobra god. That's the god of, I think, Lower Egypt. So we got the lower and upper, the vulture and the Wedjet. Here's somebody's rendition of Israel's tabernacle curtains with winged protectors on them. The cherubim are winged creatures that also stand guard. The lampstand is meant to look like a tree in a garden. The table has on it bread as an offering in God's presence. Almost every wall of an Egyptian temple has tables covered with offerings, including bread. I just started learning how to read hieroglyphs a couple months ago, and one of the most common sequences of words are the ones that describe an offering. An offering which the king gives to fill in the blank god, a voice offering of bread and beer, beef and barley. Like, they would list the things, but bread and beer are the two most often mentioned. And here we have a table. I mean, in the tabernacle, we have a table of bread being offered, just like these tables. Okay, we can't talk about similarities without talking about clothing. There was a special display in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo of linens and fabrics and the dyes that were used. So this is ancient fabric, fine linen, that was rolled up. And then what is the object on the left? Anybody know? It's underwear. In particular, this is King Tut's underwear. He was buried with 134 pairs of underwear. Come to think of it, that's one for every pillar at Karnak. I wonder if I'm getting my numbers right. It's a lot of underwear, and it's made from linen, and they would just tie it. You bring the triangle up and then tie it at your waist. And what I think is just kind of amusing is that God makes a big deal about underwear when he's telling the high priests and the priests what they're supposed to wear. He doesn't want their nakedness exposed, so he prescribes linen underwear, and here's what it probably looked like. Just a few more connections. So many places, what you see is a deity handing the symbol of life to the nose of the pharaoh, which is a way of symbolizing the giving of the spirit, that is the spirit of rulership and the authorization to rule, or the giving of life to the pharaoh. So here's two examples from Ramses III. Here's a three-dimensional version of the pouring of the water of life over the pharaoh on the left and on the right. Another scene where life is being put up to Pharaoh's Pharaoh's face. This is Ramses II getting life from Amun-Re, who's a kind of mashup of two different gods. And here's two more examples. Well, example of giving life, and then the lotus plant was also something that gives life. So you'll see them with the lotus plant up to their face, like breathing in the breath of life. Why am I telling you this? Because at the end of the tabernacle instructions, God designates two guys to oversee the work in the tabernacle. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I've chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, to engage in all kinds of crafts." And then we meet Oholiab as well. So these men who were appointed to lead this building project were imbued with the Spirit of God to do so. And I wonder if they pictured the scenes like these when they heard that. Another commonality is Pharaoh and the deity are often pictured face to face, like having a real close-up chat, nose to nose. And we read in chapters 33 and 34 about Moses' face-to-face encounter with God. I mean, it's a little ambiguous, like no one can see God's face and live, and yet no one knew God like Moses face-to-face. So it kind of goes both ways, but this face-to-face relationship is something unique. It's not every Egyptian who gets to be face-to-face with their gods. Moses has this special role appointed to hear from God and then tell the people, tell the people what God said, or carry out what God said to do. The golden calf is an interesting story, and I've often wondered why a calf? Like why did they choose that particular symbol? We saw lots of cows and bulls on the walls of these temples. There are two main gods who are pictured as a bull. Hathor is one of them. She's a goddess of fertility. And then Re, the sun god, is sometimes seen as a bull. So the one in the center is the coolest because it's gold, but it's actually from fairly later in history, like 200 BC. So the one on the right is a picture of Ramses II being protected by you see him standing under the chin of the goddess Hathor, under her protection. So my point is that when the Israelites were thinking, like, we want a God who will lead us, it would have made sense for them to make a calf idol that looked like so much of what they had seen in Egypt. So what's our takeaway? 3 things. To me, I've been convinced over and over again that the account of the Exodus fits the ancient context. It's using symbols and technologies and vocabulary and sensibilities that fit that context. That tells me that the book of Exodus is authentic. I also love it that Yahweh used the language conventions and imagery to communicate effectively. This tells us that Yahweh is an effective communicator. He doesn't show up in Air Force One or in a Tesla or he doesn't show up on a motorcycle. Like, he's not anachronistic in the way he's trying to communicate. And then Yahweh co-opted the symbols of Egypt. Why? To demonstrate his superiority to Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. In Exodus, we hear that God is defeating the gods of Egypt. How does he do it? He does it by beating them at their own game. If you want to prove that you're the best football player in the world, you win a Super Bowl. If you want to prove that you're the best figure skater in the world, you win an Olympic gold medal. In the ancient world, if you want to prove that you're the strongest god of all, you have a strong hand and an outstretched arm, and you drown your enemies in the sea. That's the means of demonstrating your superiority to these other gods. If Yahweh showed up today to lead us out of somewhere to somewhere else, I don't think he'd use the same symbols that we see in Egypt. It probably would be Air Force One. And it probably would involve, more of the symbols that we're used to seeing. But God knows who he's talking to, and he communicates well in that context. All right, that's what I've got.
So quick little round of Q&A, hopefully. So again, 2 rules for the chapter for Q&A. First rule is that we do ask that you ask a question. Oftentimes, you've probably been there. People will go on and on and on and tell you what they think about a subject, and there's no question.
Yeah.
So if you need to set up your question with a little bit of commentary, that's fine. But please ask a question. Please try and keep your commentary brief so that other people will have an opportunity to ask a question. Second rule of the chapter is, I'm the president. I get to ask the first question.
Okay.
Okay? So you mentioned referring to possible anachronisms of camels and chariots.
Yes.
And how people will say that this is evidence that these books were written later because camels weren't domesticated at that time. And the chariots were in Egypt, especially at the time of Joseph. I think there is really good historical record as far as camels. I think that's easy to refute. Chariots, it's widely believed that the Hyksos brought chariots into Egypt, which would have been the time of Joseph and Moses.
Or the time of Joseph. So one thing we didn't talk about is the dating of the Exodus. I mentioned Ramses II a lot. I tend to think that Ramses II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. That's the argument that this book is making on the Ark of the Covenant. If you take the technologies, you can plot on the calendar when certain technologies developed, and the Ark of the Covenant, in the form that we have it, fits best in the time of Pharaoh Ramses II. Plus, you have all of the symbolism of the size of the tent and all of that. That seems like it makes the most sense for Ramses II, which would put Joseph ruling Egypt during the Hyksos, and maybe would explain why they were open to an outsider rising in government.
So for you, that would be more evidence for the late Exodus
yes.
as opposed to the early
That's
Exodus.
right.
And the late Exodus is what Dr. Hoffmeyer espouses as well. Excellent.
Yeah.
So if you have a question, if you will raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone to you to ask a question. So I'll start here.
So how would you respond to someone who's, rather than saying that these similarities showed that God was trying to be superior in all that he did, to instead saying, well, there really was no God, and Moses was just trying to convince the people that there was power by using examples from what they knew in Egypt.
Yeah, so then I would go back to the signs and wonders, and I would say Moses couldn't have caused a hailstorm, brought the locusts and the frogs and turned the water to blood. So there's supernatural things going on that even Pharaoh's own magicians are saying this is the finger of God. So I would probably point back there. I've kind of waffled a little on the terms that I've used. We usually talk about the 10 plagues. I'm convinced that we shouldn't call them the plagues because only one of them is called a plague in the Bible, and that's the plague that comes on the livestock. All of the rest are referred to as signs and wonders, and I count 12 of them, not just 10. The Bible never says there are 10. That's just our summary of it. If you include the staff into snake as a sign, which Pharaoh says, show me a wonder to prove Yahweh is real. And Moses does the thing. So it seems to me that belongs in the signs and wonders. And then it seems to me that the defeat of Pharaoh at the sea is certainly a sign as well. So that gives us 12 signs and wonders. Yeah.
Speaking of timing, you're probably familiar with Victor Velikovsky's theories of chronology and those presented in patterns of evidence. What's your
Yes, okay, Patterns of Evidence for the Exodus is a well-made film that has a fascinating thesis, and his thesis is that all of Egyptian chronology is off by a certain number of years. I don't remember whether it's 400 years, and he wants to shift the whole Egyptian chronology 400 years in one direction so that it lines up differently with the biblical evidence, and kind of voila, everything comes together. I've talked with Jim Hoffmeyer about that film before I really was in the weeds studying Egypt and the Exodus myself, and he said, it's ridiculous, even though the film is well made and seems persuasive if you don't know the context. You can't just shift Egyptian chronology over 400 years because it was established by a whole multitude of methods. Like there's the Amarna letters that are letters between the pharaohs and other kings. And so you can't have a letter, correspondence going between two kings who didn't live at the same time. So there are so many factors that establish the dating of Egyptian kingship that it really is, it's so unlikely that it's off by that many years. So fun film to watch. Some of it is like a maybe plus a maybe plus a maybe plus a maybe becomes this certainty. It's like, that's not actually how that works. Oh, look, it's been years since I've watched it, so I don't remember all the details, but oh, look, we found grinding stones in the Arabian Peninsula, like in Arabia. So now we have proof that the Israelites came here instead of there. Well, were there any inscriptions on the grinding stones that said Moses was here? No, there weren't. Sometimes I tell my students, we have a lot of different majors at Biola University, including engineering. And I say, hey, any of you engineers ever invent time travel, a time machine? I just have a quick assignment for you to do. If you could please go back in time, like around the time of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, just ask them to leave more signage everywhere they go. That'd be great. Like Moses' tent peg would, like have his name on it. That would be awesome. But we don't have that, right? So, yes.
How old was King Tut when he became Pharaoh and when he died?
I do not remember. He was like the boy king, right? I don't remember off the top of my head.
I think he was
9 when he became king? Yeah, and here's something I do know about King Tut, because we got to go into his tomb when we were in Egypt, and it's really small compared to the other ones. There's some really elaborate, tombs with different passageways and so much artwork. King Tut's tomb is like, you just get in there and you turn around and come back out. It's very small. The reason why it's more famous than some of the other tombs is because it was hiding for a long time. When they excavated the other tombs, they were taking all the rubble and dumping it in a pile, not realizing that they were covering up the entrance to King Tut's tomb. So over the years, lots of the other tombs got raided and people stole all of the treasures, but King Tut's tomb stayed sealed, I think, until the 1920s, when it was then opened up. And for the first time in modern history, we get like the complete collection of what went into a tomb. And that's where we learn, they take with them everything they would need to live in this life, they have to take with them. So if you have a bed here, you're going to need a bed there. If you have a chair here, you're going to need a chair there. So there was a chariot, and there was underwear, and there was food, and there was just everything you could imagine, including they would bury little figurines of that they thought would, because you work in life, and so you're going to have to work in the afterlife, and if you don't want to have to do so much work, your retirement plan is to bury a bunch of figurines with you because they can become alive and do the work for you. So it's really fascinating kind of how they thought about the afterlife. Yeah?
I have a more theological question.
Great.
You mentioned how the symbolism matches the conventions of the ancient time.
Yeah.
And how that shows that God is up to something then. Doesn't that, how do you reconcile with the fact that that also means that in modern times, that means we're missing a lot of the symbolism and God isn't necessarily communicating what he was communicating back then?
Yes. This is job security for me because I get to help people understand the way things worked in the ancient world. We are a long ways away from where the events in the Bible happened. We don't speak the same language, most of us. We don't have the same upbringing. And so it takes some work for us to cross that gap. We tend to think of the Bible sometimes as a book that just fell from the sky, leather bound, and with our name embossed on it. Like, this is God's love letter to me, Carmen Imes. And that's not really what it is. God does work through the power of his Spirit to make it come alive for us and to change us through it. But we can't just pretend that it was written with my questions in mind. It's answering ancient questions. One place that I think this is obvious, we've talked about all these Egypt Exodus connections, you can do the same thing in Ezekiel and see all kinds of Babylon connections. So that the imagery he sees of the God's throne coming to Babylon, like across the plains, he sees this fabulous vision in chapter 1, and it's all full of Babylonian imagery because he's in Babylon, and God wants to say, hey, I'm with you here too. So God is good like that, and he'll keep meeting us wherever we are.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. And a question about the plagues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are we supposed to take that literally, or like the Nile became blood?
Yes, so I would take it that the Nile became red like blood. I mean, it just says blood. They didn't have a way to do DNA analysis and say that it was something different, right? And so sometimes we press for scientific certainty in places where we need to take it as they would have taken it instead. What's really interesting about that particular sign is that the Nile River was thought to be the bloodstream of Osiris, one of their chief gods. And so they had this mythology already about the Nile River being blood. And then God's like, oh yeah? How about if I give you what you're asking for, and now you can't drink it? And notice too that Pharaoh's magicians, even when they have limited power and they're able to replicate a sign, they can only make it worse, they can't make it better. Like here, this would be the really impressive thing, if you could make the Nile not be blood anymore and we could drink it again. But no, all they can do is turn more water into blood. So they dig up water somewhere, they turn it to blood. What this reminds me of is the Balaam story, where Balaam, this pagan sorcerer, is unable to curse the people. If God hasn't cursed them, he could only bless them. And I think what we have in Exodus is God has determined to bring judgment on Egypt. So even the magicians with their best efforts can only bring more judgment. Oh, you made more frogs. Congratulations. Like, I'm sure everyone's really thankful that you could do that. Yes?
Okay. So, theological, mine's a little more political.
Okay.
Okay.
There's lots of politics in Exodus.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going there. Okay, so I can go right now to my understanding Wikipedia and see an Islamic Wikipedian scholar, and he'll show me how Moses didn't exist. And so therefore Israel doesn't have the right to what they're saying. Right?
Yeah.
I can go to that official Wikipedia, I'm joking about this, right? And why is that political? I can see the political ramifications. Okay, and this is an apologetic group. I'm sorry, I'm setting it all up. Okay, so let me push back a little bit at what you said. I want you to tell me, because I want to hear it. Yeah. Couldn't a Hezekiah, or whoever wrote that, I don't know, in the quiet period, or even Hezekiah in there, couldn't he have written a story that would have used the languages and the words and conveyed the technology? He would have known, he's ahead of time. Yeah. He would have known the technologies and the words if I was trying to convince my people that this is a true history, so we have identity, you know, that Moses really existed. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so you see what I'm pushing back on your statement. It's apologetics. I want you to tell me why I'm wrong.
Yes.
I think that's true.
So I'm going to take you to the end of chapter 16, where we have a little comment, a little side comment. An omer is 1/10 of an ephah, which none of us memorized when we were in Awana, and it's not our devotional verse. This is an example of where they've just had a story about collecting the manna, and they're supposed to collect an omer per person, and they're finding the need to explain that an omer is 1/10 of an ephah because no one uses omers anymore, because it matches up with an Egyptian style of measurement that is unknown in Israel. So if you're writing it in the days of Hezekiah, why wouldn't you just say they each were supposed to collect 1/10 of an ephah? Like, how do you even know what an omer is unless there's at least some core story that has been passed down all these years? Now, is it possible that somebody in the days of Hezekiah finalized the text of Exodus by collecting the stories and weaving them together and making sure it was all there? Okay, I'd be open to that. But if that was the case, they've got old stories because it's using words that people don't use anymore. And some of the most striking reuse of Egyptian words happens in the tabernacle account. So the descriptions for the furniture and the items that are being built are using Egyptian words that Hebrew doesn't even have. You wouldn't need to do that if you're writing it during the days of Hezekiah. You'd have Hebrew words for that. But because they've just come out of Egypt, whoever knows how to build was trained by Egyptian builders, right? We have Bezalel and Oholiab who are filled by the Spirit of God to do this work, but I don't think their knowledge is coming out of nowhere. It's not like they've been making mud bricks for their whole life and suddenly they know how to do a gold-plated box of acacia wood with carrying poles and rings. I doubt that. David Falk's idea in this book is he kind of has a fictional story woven in, like maybe it was like this kind of story, where Bezalel is an apprentice in a furniture shop in Egypt. Most of the Hebrews were making mud bricks, but there were a couple of guys who got some specialized training, and that comes in handy when it's time to build the tabernacle, and God takes that training they had and he imbues it with his Spirit so that it's for his glory, for his purposes. Yeah. Oh, here.
So some years ago, I remember in Rodney Stark's Discovering God book, I read an account of a pharaoh, Egyptian pharaoh, became a heretic, the Egyptian gods, and became monotheistic.
Yes, Akhenaten is his name.
And that was soon before the theory.
Yeah.
Is that soon before the Israelites arrived in
Yes.
Egypt, right? So is that meaning? Is that true?
Yeah.
Is there any sort of supposed connection between that?
So I have been waiting to write the introduction to my commentary until I get through the whole book, and then I'm going to circle back and spend more time on date and chronology and all of that. So I don't have totally fresh in my mind the exact dates for Akhenaten, and having, actually he has a chart right here of the pharaohs, so that might help me a little bit.
Akhenaten would have been after the Hyksos.
Yes. So he's before King Tut and before Ramses. So he's quite a ways before Ramses II. Here's what I can tell you about Akhenaten. He was considered a heretic because he wanted to consolidate all the worship to just worshiping the sun god. And so there had been some attempts to merge the sun god with other gods, and you get sort of mashup gods. But he's trying to just get it all in one place. And so he actually goes through and chisels out of the stone the mention of other gods or the symbols of other gods in lots of places. And it is intriguing to think, what relationship does this have with the Hebrews being there and their idea of monotheism? His idea of monotheism isn't quite the same as theirs, but there is some shared concern about multiple gods. After Akhenaten loses the throne, the next person comes by and just tries to ruin as much of his stuff as they can. So it's just typical politics. Yeah. Yes?
Is there any hieroglyphic evidence of any of the plagues?
I'm not aware of any texts that describe the plagues. There's one text, the Instruction of Ipuwer, I think is what it's called, that describes water turning to blood and other things. It's more of like here's what might happen to you if you're really bad. And there's several negative things that can happen. I don't have them memorized. If I was Pharaoh, I would not be commissioning a stone memorial to my own embarrassment or failure, right? We don't typically put on our resume all the jobs we applied for and didn't get, or all the book proposals we sent off that got rejected, or all the low grades we had, right? We highlight our wins and we put them in the best light. And this is why we get Ramses II, touting his Battle of Kadesh everywhere, even though probably it wasn't that decisive of a victory. So, wow, that was really loud. I'm so sorry. It says my battery's running low, but it's plugged in, so I don't know why it did that. We don't need my laptop anymore, so I'm just gonna close it and take this out so we don't have that happen again. So sorry. All right, that was the voice from on high. Where were we? Yeah, so sometimes people say there's not enough archaeological evidence of the Exodus. And my question is, what evidence would you expect to find of a mostly pastoral people living in Goshen, which has a high erosion rate because it's all these tributaries, not tributaries, but the outflow of the Nile, and it's by the sea, whose work was mostly making mud brick, which have eroded by now in that area, who then crossed the wilderness with only what they could carry. So it's not like they're leaving plastic wrappers or Tupperware in the Sinai Peninsula. If you've got a grinding stone that you've got so that you can make bread with the manna, you're going to carry that with you. You're not going to just leave it. So people sometimes will say, well, there's no evidence. And I want to say, okay, have you ever been camping before? Raise your hand if you've been camping. If I went to a place where you camped last summer, would I have any evidence that you were there?
Not if you're a Boy Scout.
Right? Not if you're a Boy Scout and you packed everything out. Now, I did spend some time on the beach this week on the Gulf Coast, and I found lots of evidence of human occupation. There were lots of plastic water bottle lids littering the beach and ropes and other things, other trash. So there was evidence of people. I can't prove who drank those drinks. I can't even prove that they didn't dispose of them properly. I don't know what happened to the trash and where this floated in from. There's only so much you can tell from a water bottle lid. So even if you find grinding stones or if you find, whatever, it's not going to be proof of somebody unless you have labeled objects. Pharaoh's not going to memorialize his failures. We're not going to find this on temple walls. What we do have is Pharaoh Merneptah, who puts up a stone monument talking about the kingdoms that he's in relationship with, and he mentions Israel, and that's in the late 13th century. So that tells us Israel has to be in the land of Canaan by the late 13th century for him to mention them. There's our sort of proof of the Israelites. But I wouldn't expect to find anything specifically like that on the temple walls. We do have lots of examples of Semitic-looking slaves painted on temple walls doing things like making mud bricks or being beaten or whatever. So the idea that there could have been another people group from Canaan who'd come down there and had been enslaved fits very much with the evidence that we have. Yes?
Came in late, so you might have said, but you've just taken this to an area I've never even been, but it always hit me as really authentic that they said that they mummified Joseph.
Yeah.
To me, because we have a Jewish person, a friend of my mom, and I read a little bit on it. They bury them. It's so alien to the Jews because they bury them in a casket with holes in the bottom so that they will just decompose as fast as possible.
Yes.
So will they are really right that Joseph?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Well, I don't even know what
it is fascinating to me that Joseph at the end of Genesis gives strict instructions to take his bones with them to Canaan when they come out of Egypt. If he's as high in command as we're told that he is, he would have been fabulously wealthy. He would have been able to be embalmed, excuse me, and mummified and had a whole funerary temple built in his honor, or at least a really nice high quality tomb. And it's showing us that he actually doesn't buy into the whole religious, the whole Egyptian idea of the afterlife. Because if he bought into their idea, then he would want to be buried there where people will continue to bring him offerings to keep him alive in the afterlife. And he's like, no, take my bones to Canaan, cut me off from this whole system. So that does strike me as being a very anti-Egyptian move that he makes. Yeah?
I'm going to make this the penultimate question.
What's the largest piece of evidence for Exodus?
The largest piece of evidence. I think maybe I'll give you my favorite piece of evidence, which is that first picture I showed you of the brick making process. I mean, the Bible, yeah. The brick making process matches what we're told that they did. And when you go to Egypt today, you can still see mud bricks in use all over the place. Jim Hoffmeyer actually grew up in a mud brick house in Egypt. People still live in them today because it's the best kind of insulation against the Egyptian heat and cold. And so the Israelites in Canaan did not build with mud brick. They built with stone because that's what you got a lot of in Canaan is rocks. So they built their houses out of rocks. They didn't build out of mud bricks. So if they were imagining a story, inventing a story about Egypt, I don't know if they would have thought of mud bricks as the thing that everybody had to do, the labor that they had to do. Yes?
Looking at image of God, heart of man, my question is there like talk about why the Egyptians worshipped the way they worshipped, and specifically like their belief in afterlife? Like, is there anything about where that comes from?
I'm not an Egyptologist, so I don't know kind of where I can't say with confidence where it comes from. But I will say, I'm glad you mentioned image of God, because this is a really interesting difference between Egypt and Israel. The Egyptians set up statues of their kings and of their gods all over the place. And there's so many of them that survived to the present in museums and in temples. One thing you'll notice as you go through the museums is that a lot of them are missing their noses. Have you ever noticed that? A lot of them are broken off at the nose. Now, there's a couple of different theories about this. One theory is that if the statue falls over, the nose is going to be the first thing to break off. Okay, but many of these statues have this beard thing that would be far more fragile than the nose, I think. So the other theory is that when you want to decommission a statue, you cut the nose off. Remember the pictures I showed you of the gods holding up the life symbol to their noses? They believe that life and breath come in and out through the nose. That's how you stay alive. And so if a king wants to survive into the afterlife, he sets up a statue of himself that can sort of embody his presence going forward. And then if you're the next king and you don't like that guy, you just chop off his nose and now he's dead. He was dead alive before, but now he's dead by cutting off his nose. So the Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was the image of God, that Pharaoh was the physical representative of divine power and presence, and then he ruled by divine authority. The Bible gives us a radically different picture, saying every human being is the image of God, and that God does not want to be represented by the way, image we think of in lots of ways, but the word tselem in Hebrew just means statue, idol statue. So in Genesis, when it says God made humankind as his image, it's saying we are the equivalent or the replacement for the statues of the Egyptians that they're worshiping. So God says, I want to be represented by living, breathing people who are fanning out and filling the earth and subduing it. It's a radically different picture because it shows every one of us is valuable, and God's invited us into good work that we need to do, that we do collaboratively side by side, male and female, young and old, rich and poor. It doesn't matter your age, your class, your ethnicity. You are the image of God, and you've been asked to rule over creation. And that's radically different. It's a radically different vision of reality, and you see it play out in the way Pharaoh rules his country, because he's exploiting people to get stuff for himself instead of recognizing everyone as a fellow image of God. So I do have a book about the image of God, the green one on the table, if you want more on that. And then the orange one, bearing God's name, is all about God's calling Israel to be his covenant people at Sinai. So I've traced those themes through the Bible. Thank you so much.
Excellent.